Good evening. We're glad to see each of you for this year's Q3 conference, Being Human, Created in God's Image. We're happy that you've come, taken the time, and made the trip to be with us here at Asbury, and I don't believe that you'll be disappointed. We're very excited about what's going to happen. Dr. Timothy Tennant is the president of Asbury Theological Seminary, and I'm so pleased he could be with us tonight, and I'm going to call on him now, and he's going to officially greet you on behalf of the seminary.
Welcome. We're so glad you're here. We're so thankful for this opportunity to gather in these days to reflect on this important theme. If there were three phrases that could really best capture the Christian cosmology, it would be the three phrases: He speaks, He breathes, and He enters. He spoke the world into existence, He breathed into us the breath of life, and He enters into the creation of His making in the incarnation. The first Q3 was based on the first point, the creation of the world. This theme, of course, is on God breathing into us the breath of life. What does it mean for us to be humanity in the image of God? So we pray and we dedicate these days to reflect Christianly on this great theme in light of all the wonderful research and evidence and thoughts that are coming to us from around the world. Let's pray together. Lord, we thank you for the great privilege it is to be in your presence these days. We commit this conference into your mighty hands. We pray you would teach us, guide us, bless every speaker. Bless our reflections. May we think Christianly about our world, about our place in it. And we thank you, O Lord, for the great imprint of the divine presence into our lives. We ask all this in Jesus' precious name. Amen. Bless you all.
My name's Dr. Mike Pasquarello. I've been very fortunate to be the director of this project, having a number of other folks work with me and investing a considerable amount of time and energy to make it possible. We're going to fast forward and ask you to file away in your memory bank next year's conference. And so, if we may, we're going to listen to a brief word from our sponsor. Hi, I'm Dr. Mike Pasquarello. It's my great pleasure this year's Q3 conference, Being Human, Created in God's Image. I know we're in store for a great time, preaching, plenary speakers, and workshop leaders, all for your benefit, to help you to understand better how faith and science work together in our life and mission as God's people in the world. We're glad that you're here. But I want to take a minute to ask you to think about next year's conference in 2012. It will take place at the same time of the year, beginning of March, from Monday, March the 5th, through Wednesday, March the 7th. The theme will be ecclesiology. The title of the conference is The Church, Sign of God's New Creation. We'll look at the church from a variety of angles, considering how God has raised up a people who have emerged from within the world and in time to witness to God's saving activity as a people who draw their identity from the past, who experience and live for God in the present, but also are oriented to a great future where God is leading and drawing the whole creation to a glorious conclusion. Two of the keynote speakers who will be with us are theologians whose work has intersected with science for many years, Dr. Ted Peters and Dr. Philip Clayton. And they'll talk about the church in relation to the universe, Christ, and the church. They'll talk about the past, the present, and the future. They'll talk about time and space and what we do in church in terms of the proclamation of the Word, prayer, worship, the sacraments, and the other practices that join us together and unite our life as God's people. We think it will be very informative for our theological understanding, but also very practical for our work in ministry as we bring to a conclusion 3 wonderful conferences of Science for Ministry that have been funded very generously by the John Templeton Foundation. So we look forward to seeing you again next year.
Well, now let's begin 2011, being human, created in God's image. Our opening address will be given by my colleague, Dr. Brian Edgar, who's professor of theology and ethics. He teaches primarily on our distance learning program. He's based in Melbourne, Australia, and is a wonderful teacher and a very, very fine theologian. He's been a recipient of Templeton grants in the past for the work that he's done in writing for educational resources that bring together faith and science, and he has extensive training and experience in this field. After last year's conference, some of you suggested to us that a good way to begin this year would be to share with you the working theological convictions and assumptions that really underlie what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. And particularly why in the Wesleyan tradition this has always been of such importance for us. John Wesley was very interested in the intersection of faith and science and looked at the emerging science of his day in light of the church's confessed Trinitarian theology. And so Dr. Brian Edgar is going to lead us off, and I'm very grateful that he's with us. He's teaching an intensive course on theological anthropology that runs concurrently with this conference. And he just seems to be the right person to lead us and to get us off to a good start. So welcome, Dr. Brian Edgar.
Oh, thank you very much, Mike, and good evening to all of you. Indeed, why is an institution like Asbury Theological Seminary holding a conference on science like this one, particularly focusing upon the human person? Well, let me suggest 2 answers to this question. The first is, briefly, that there is indeed a Wesleyan imperative in regard to Christian ministry to care about the science of our day. And the second part of the answer is that we ought to be very interested in the science of the human person, because there is today a new situation regarding the future of the human person. I say a new situation. You might call it a crisis if you like, or you might call it an opportunity. But there is certainly a new and developing situation. How are we going up there? Okay, thank you. Well, if we're going to answer the first part of this about the Wesleyan imperative, we might well ask the question, why did John Wesley, a man with so many pressing issues to address, purchase a portable static electricity machine so that he could electrocute people? Well, he did. He didn't kill anybody. It would be difficult to do that with static electricity, but he certainly shocked them. But I'll come back to that later. And why did a great evangelist, a man committed to the gospel, spend a significant amount of time reading many of the latest scientific books, laboriously summarizing them, and then publishing what amounted to be a summary of all the best scientific knowledge of the day, which is what he did? Well, I'll come back to that later as well. And why did a man so concerned with holiness and the human soul spend so much time writing about the health of the human body? He spent time collecting medical information, collected safe and effective cures to 288 disorders that he published in 1747 as a primitive physic, which then he's published subsequently in 32 updated editions, which demonstrates 2 things: that it was very popular, and secondly, that it was important to him to keep it updated. Wesley indeed was very involved in the science of his day, And interestingly, he was involved for reasons that were so typically Wesleyan and reasons that still make sense today. And I kind of hope that they're connected with the reasons that you might have for attending this conference. Why have you come here? To enjoy the fraternal relationships that we have with like-minded people? To enjoy the stimulation that it provides for our thinking? Perhaps to gain continuing education credit or credit towards a degree? Or perhaps it's just an opportunity to get away from all that other stuff in life for a few days. As far as I'm concerned, I've come because I really enjoy the 34-hour travel time it takes me to get from Melbourne, Australia to Wilmore, Kentucky. But Wesley was not interested in science out of idle curiosity. It wasn't a hobby. It wasn't done for financial gain. He did these things, I would suggest, for at least 3 reasons that are so typically Wesleyan. To be able to minister to the poor more effectively, in order to understand the creating and redeeming God more deeply, and to understand God's work of grace in human life more fully. Firstly, with regard to these electrical machines, which all came about as a result of hearing news about Benjamin Franklin's experiments with electricity in the early 1750s, which of course took place here in the US, but they became widely known in England through the publication of letters that he sent over to England. And in the midst of all the excitement about this new electricity, it was found that there were people whose health, in one way or another, benefited from having electricity pass through their bodies. Now, this is not strange. I'm sure that many of you have benefited from that. And so various people in England began experimenting with it in terms of health. And Wesley actually became the best known of them all. He ended up with 4 of these machines. He purchased them and began by electrifying himself to see what it would do for the various pains that he had. The machines have a hollow glass cylinder with a metal bar running through the middle and a handle to rotate it. It rubs up against a leather pad, and it's all mounted on insulated legs, and so it generates a lot of static electricity, and then when you hold on to it, you get zapped. Wesley treated himself and other people with varying degrees of success. He treated what he called paralytic disorders, which meant, in our terms, muscle and joint disorders, inflammation, stiffness, rheumatism, and sprains, and also various nervous disorders, including people with epilepsy and fits, people with headache, as well as toothache, headaches, and heart palpitations. And as I say, I dare say that many of you have been treated in this way by probably slightly more sophisticated machines than these. If you go to a physiotherapist or a doctor, there are all kinds of machines these days that will run electric currents through your body in order to stimulate healing in muscles or ligaments. They can promote growth. They can improve our healing. And they can be passed through electrical pulses through the brain to help control involuntary muscle tremors, and can be also used, perhaps a little more controversially, in ECT therapy, and of course it's used in cardiac pacemakers as well. And so this was just the beginning of this treatment by electricity. Wesley's book, there was of course a book that's also very Wesleyan. He wrote a book called Electricity Made Plain and Useful. It was actually highly praised by none other than J.B. Priestley, the famous theologian, philosopher, political theorist, and pioneer of electricity. He commended Wesley's book. But why did Wesley do it? Well, he was asked very directly in the London magazine. They asked, "Why do you meddle with electricity?" And he replied, "For the same reason that I published Primitive Physics, in order to do as much good as I can." He saw it as a gift of God, which was provided in order to benefit people. And this was done right at a time when any medical service was quite expensive and difficult to obtain, unless you were of the right class and had plenty of money. He provided it as a free clinical service for the poor, a quite deliberate alternative to the services provided by the medical profession of his day. In fact, he was quite critical of the doctors, who, he said, preferred to use expensive and therefore profitable medications rather than cheap remedies such as this. And in return, the medical fraternity did not approve of Wesley. He was not, according to their criteria, properly qualified, although their disdain may also have been because he was setting a very bad example by not charging people fees. This immediately raises questions about why we are here again. Is it for enjoyment, for stimulation, education, or so that in some way we might serve the poor of today? The second of these questions that were asked concerns Wesley's Survey of the Wisdom of God in Creation, or a compendium of natural philosophy, published in 2 volumes in 1763. And it contains his own laboriously created summaries of quite a number of the most contemporary and best scientific writings of the day, which he accumulated and put into this volume, with occasionally, although not too often, some theological commentary on the end of it, only very, very briefly usually. Why on earth would he spend his time doing that? He undertook that task because there were those who claimed that the new science that was developing of the day meant that God was no longer needed as an explanation for the natural phenomena of the world. This kind of attitude that was emerging is often summed up in the famous, although probably apocryphal, words of Pierre-Simon de Laplace in France, the French scientist, who responded to the observation that God did not appear in his writing about astronomy. "Oh, I have no need of that hypothesis," he said. And in the face of that kind of attitude, Wesley wanted to show that the appropriate response was not to dispose of God, but to praise the God who did all this. He wanted to show that science did not oppose faith, but confirmed it. Which again brings us back to our motives for being here. Is it to confirm faith, that of ourselves and that of others? In 1749, the physician and friend of Charles Wesley, David Hartley, produced a book called Observations on Man. His analysis of the human person concluded that the new science could show that all thought, feeling, and will was not only dependent upon, but determined and controlled by the brain. It was really a thorough determinism of human experience and behaviour. It certainly didn't take long for this to arise in the context of the new science, and it is certainly still around today. In fact, what we might call nothing buttery is probably even more common today. The scientific terminology varies according to the era, but the message is the same, that the latest discoveries have shown that the human person is nothing but a bunch of neurons firing or a collection of DNA or whatever. So much so that the well-known scientist Francis Crick, who was co-discoverer with Watson, Franklin and Wilkins of the structure of DNA, wrote in his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, "The astonishing hypothesis is that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." That's it. There is no more. It's a dramatic presentation of an alleged meaning of being human, that you are nothing other than nerve cells and molecules. But you know, I wonder whether anyone would have bothered to read Crick's book if he had started it in this way. "I, Francis Crick, my opinions and my science and the thoughts expressed in this book consist of nothing more than the random behaviour of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules." Why would you bother reading? I'm sure he would like us to think that there was actually some meaning associated with what he writes. And so there is. But if that kind of theory of human nature is right, there really is none. This is the point, I think, at which Wesleyan theology has a lot to offer. This is the kind of a topic that we're dealing with in this conference. It deals with the theology of the relationship of divine sovereignty and human freedom working together in the life of the human person. Wesley responded to Hartley by writing Thoughts on Necessity, arguing against Hartley's determinism. And the issue is still with us today. And I do believe that Wesleyan theology has a distinctive contribution to make as we reflect further and more deeply about the way that human freedom, divine sovereignty, and biological factors work together in our lives. But I mentioned that there is a second reason for looking at the science of the human person today, along with this Wesleyan imperative. And I think the second is that we face a new situation with regard to the human person today. And I use the word today fairly loosely, speaking about an era that is developing at the moment. And I seriously think it will have to be compared at some point with the changes that took place in the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries that brought major changes to manufacturing and agriculture, and also to the information technology revolution of the 20th century with computing, which has changed the way we work and think and educate and manufacture. Now, in the 21st century, we're at the threshold of a biological revolution that has the potential not merely to change the environment in which we live, but to change our own human structure and form. It involves the merging, the confluence of a wide range of scientific disciplines which are coming together and creating overall a discipline of immense power. Don't be mistaken when I talk about this. I am not presenting a doomsday scenario. Many of these changes can be profoundly good, but they also bring significant ethical questions. This biological revolution has already begun, and we have seen the beginning of it in the 20th century. Medical technology has developed in leaps and bounds, treating all kinds of disorders, illnesses, and diseases. Of course, it has raised questions about the inequitable levels of access to medical care that is profoundly influenced by whether you happen to be born in West Africa or Wilmore, and whether you have money or not. At the end of life, medical technology has become incredibly efficient at saving and extending life, enabling people to live longer, healthy lives, but it has also extended the process of dying, enabling life to continue when previously it would have come to a much quicker end. And this has created serious questions about the appropriateness of euthanasia. At the other end, at the beginning of life, medical technology is able to intervene in the reproductive processes in a way that hasn't been possible previously. Perhaps to end life through abortion or to bring life through reproductive technologies like IVF. But it raises questions about embryo experimentation, the storage of artificially created embryos, and the appropriateness of the use of donors and surrogates. We're into the era of gene diagnosis, working out the cause of various genetic disorders, and once having identified them, being able to begin the process of doing something about eliminating them. All of this comes about, or is related to, the hugely successful Human Genome Project, which finished a number of years ago, which provided that basic map of the genetic structure of the human person. But these lead us on into issues that are only going to develop in the future, questions about cloning and aspects of genetic engineering, what kind of genetic modifications are going to be appropriate. Is simply eliminating genetic disorders the aim, or does it go further towards genetic enhancements? There is talk about designer babies and how to be taller, stronger, fitter, faster through genetic means. We're all aware that people are living longer and healthier lives, and as science and technology gradually works on one disorder or another, people are living longer and healthier, but the overall expected maximum age has not changed all that significantly for a long time. You cure one disorder and then people have the temerity to go and die of something else. And so it's difficult to push that maximum. More people are getting towards that maximum in a very healthy manner, but they still insist on dying. But there are now people trying to work on the basic techniques of aging to work out whether it is possible to persuade our bodies to go on living for longer. And telomere research, telomere therapy is one of the main areas looking at this. People are already starting that very difficult and probably inaccurate process of predicting when the first telomere therapy to increase the reproduction of cells, to keep that going, when that will take place. But it is interesting that the 2009 Nobel Prize in Physiology was awarded to people working precisely in that area of telomere therapy. It would be interesting to ask, what do you think it would be like to live to be 400 years old? It would certainly change things if we can extend the human lifespan even by a much smaller margin than that. And then there are stem cells, manipulating cells to change and create any of the kind of cells that we have in the human body in order to repair disorders. There is the question about swapping genes from one species to another, plant, animal, and human. The real issue is that when you get down to looking at a gene at the very lowest level, as a chemist does, a molecular chemist, looking at DNA, DNA is DNA is DNA is DNA is DNA, and it doesn't matter where it comes from. There would, in fact, I don't think, be any way of distinguishing unless you knew whether a gene came from a plant, an animal, or a person. And many of the genes that we have as people are shared with other animals, and not only those primates that are similar to us, but a wide range of other animals and entities as far away as snails and slugs that we share genetic material with. And what about swapping genes from plant to animal to person? What are the implications of that? What are the boundaries of what we call a species? Is there such a thing as a boundary? What are the limits of humanness in terms of the manipulation of genes? Again, a scientist working at the lowest level is to some extent quite entitled to say there are no such thing as human genes or animal genes or plant genes. There are genes that humans have, and there are genes that plants have and genes that animals have, but they can be mixed around. How far can that go? And then, of course, there's just a small area of neuroscience and what we can do. We already modify behavior through medication, whether it's Prozac for anxiety or lithium for bipolar disorders, antidepressants, antipsychotics, and this is simply going to continue and develop. And neuroscience, the analysis of what's taking place in the human brain, is only in its infancy, really, at the moment. It's, I think, going to be astounding. And then what about computers? At the moment we have computers that are based upon silicon, and it all works on a binary system with a switch that's either on or off, 1 or 0. And everything is reduced to a long sequence of 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, and on it goes. And that you can do all of the computer programming simply with that binary kind of system. Well, DNA is also extremely good at recording information. It's the way it records the information for our entire bodies. And DNA is really simply a sequence not of 1 and 0, but use the terms G, A, T, and C to represent the names of some basically unpronounceable acids. And all that DNA is G, T, A, C, G, G, T, A, C, C, G, G, T, T, and on it goes. And a certain length of that comprises a gene, which is able to make a transcription and send instructions around your body. Now, wouldn't it be great to develop a computer that is based on DNA? We are already dependent upon computers to a large extent, aren't we? They sit on our desk, they sit in our pockets. We can't get by without them. But if it's based on DNA, of course, you don't actually have to have it in your pocket or on your desk. Ultimately, there's no reason why it can't be built into a person. And so DNA computing is being explored. Now, the point is that people are working in so many different areas at so many different levels, from the very molecular up through the cell, through organisms, through bodies and systems, and in all of those areas that I mentioned. And they are coming together and they are combining into, in a sense, a single science of examining the human person and how we can change who we are. There is really a sense that we are now, in terms of human history, at a new point where, to use the word evolution in its non-original sense, we can control our own evolution into the future. We can or will be able to control the way we are to a large extent as people. And exactly what it is that we will be able to do in that regard is still something of an open question, an unresolved issue. Certainly physically, biologically, there probably will be very little that can't be replaced. What the case is as far as the more intangible dimensions of human life is concerned is really yet to be worked out. People are speaking now about transhumanism, the possibility of moving into a new phase of being a human person, something that is so different to what we've experienced in the past. Now, when is all this going to happen? And I've no idea. It's been said with regard to all of this kind of future studies and prognostications about the future that there is a tendency to overestimate the speed at which these things will happen, but also to underestimate the significance of them when they do. Now, I think there's something in that. I may be overestimating how soon it's going to be, but I don't think we should underestimate the ultimate significance of what is going to happen. And so we are looking at a radically new situation for the human person. And this raises for us the importance of reflecting upon the ethical implications of being a human person, getting in along with the development of the science and asking ourselves, how does our Christian understanding of being made in the image of God relate to this whole situation? So let me say a few words about being made in the image of God. And I want to talk about it in terms of the way that that concept is used ethically. God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and over all the wild animals and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. I'm going to generalize a little bit about that and say that generally speaking, there have been two broad approaches to interpreting that concept. And I explain them by using just an analogy. The first broad approach sees the image, I think, as kind of substantial. If I take a quarter out of my pocket, it's got an image of George Washington on there. It's an image that has been stamped onto this coin, and it bears George Washington's image. And it's possible to think about being made in the image of God in that kind of way, to relate it to a theology of creation, that God has made us and has stamped onto us as people, as human beings, something that is reflective of his own image, so that in the way that we live, we reflect God. The difficulty with this is knowing exactly what that is, because the text really doesn't tell us what it is. Is it our personality? Is it our spirituality? Is it our creativity? Is it our rationality? Or something else that is distinctive of being made in the image of God? But whatever it is, and leaving that aside for the moment, to ask how it's used ethically, whatever that is, when it's used ethically, it's generally related to a strong theology of creation that says, well, that's the way that God has made us, and that's the way that we should be. So let's just leave things as they are. It becomes a very positive, I think in many ways, healthy and very good recognition of the importance of the value of the human person as we are created, and that every person is made in the image of God, every person has value, and I think it's used very appropriately there. And it's generally used as a kind of a limitation on those attempts to modify human nature that worry us a little bit. Hey, look, this is the way that we've been made. Perhaps we can use all of these technologies that I've just mentioned before. Perhaps we can use them to rectify disorders and get back to the position that we should be in, but let's not go any further. Let's just leave things basically as they are. Interestingly, there has, in ethical circles in more recent years, a different approach emerged, which takes, I think, the very legitimate role of connecting the idea of being made in the image of God much more with a theology of redemption rather than with a theology of creation. Of course, anybody who reads their Bible about the image of God will immediately want to say, Brian, let's not separate those two things from creation from redemption. But all I'm doing is saying that there is another move that stresses the other side a little bit more, which picks up verses like Romans 8:29 that says we are to be conformed to the image of Christ Jesus, that he is the true image, and we, in a sense, create the image in us through being conformed to Jesus Christ. I used the analogy of a quarter and an image being stamped onto something before. Let me use a different image. There's a different kind of an image when you come up to a mirror. There is an image in the mirror, but you cannot grab a hold of it. It is not a substantial image. It's much more dynamic, unmovable, and changeable. As you move in, move away, something gets in the way. It can be blurred. It may not be clear. It is something that is very changeable, but it is there in terms of your closeness, your relationship to the mirror. And there is a sense in which that reflects this idea that as we come closer to Jesus Christ, we more reflect the image of God in us, as he is in us and we are in him. So it's much more dynamic. The image is much more intangible. The first view looks at the way things are and says it's a past thing, it's happened. The other one looks at the future and says it's how we will be. It is more directed to what will be in the future. We are creating and building the image in us. Now, can you see that if you make this ethical jump, there is this ethical jump, by the way, whenever we say, well, the image of God means that we need to be conservative about medical technology. We're making a very interesting ethical step there, which we may want to analyze at some point, but I'm not going to do that now. I'm just going to assume that's quite legitimate to do that. But then if we can do that there with the redemptive side, we may make the same step and say, well, look, the image there is much more dynamic, and we are called to be creative. Maybe there is a sense in which we are called to use the creativity that we have in order to develop ourselves as human beings. The first alternative focuses very much upon us as created. We have been created in a particular way. The other one looks on it very much more as we are creative. We are creative human beings with a responsibility to be creative in this world, which ties in with one of the other parts of that Genesis story, that we are called to be administrators, carers of the world in which we live. And so you can see that there can be a tension between those two. Now, in the past, as I say, some have said we are created in God's image. Let's focus upon that. There is a new language that is around today that speaks about humanity being co-creators with God in the creative agenda of creating this world. And it's starting to say perhaps this legitimizes in some way being a little more adventurous rather than just saying, don't play God, which is the tendency of the previous. Let's not play God. It says, but we have to play God. We do play God. We do change things. We alter what God has given us. I wouldn't be seeing you too well without the glasses that I've got on. I'm changing what my perception is about. And in all kinds of ways, we are changing things. So the question is not really whether we play God, but how we play God. Now, I have to say that I've got some appreciation for both sides of this. And therefore, in that typical manner of people who set up one idea at one extreme and one idea at another extreme, you end up going down the middle. And you want to be aware of that because it can be an easy technique for somebody who's talking just to get their own point across. But I guess at the end of the day, that's where I sit. Great appreciation for this notion of the image of God as something stamped on us that marks every human being out as creative. But I think it perhaps falls down if it doesn't recognize that we do, in fact, play God. And we are called to be administrators. I see that in the co-creator side, and I see that responsibility to properly make judgments about all the technology that is there, and I appreciate that. But I do not like that term, co-creator. I do not like that term, co-creator. It puts us in too much of an exalted position. I would prefer to go back to a much more traditional term, that we are procreators. Okay. In the old original sense, it simply means to procreate, that we have the power to create life. And let's face it, humanity has always had the power to create life. They've known for a long time what produces babies. And we can just go out and do that to a large extent. And we also have the power to end life as well. I could pick up one of these chairs and beat somebody over the head. Maybe I should not do it, but that power has always lain within our hands. It is a terrible responsibility that we have to bring about life. But we do so as procreators under God. In the same way, a proconsul is responsible and represents the consul and does not have the same authority, we are called to be procreators. And so as we look at all those technologies that I went through so fast before, I think it's very appropriate that we can try and bring a Wesleyan theology that marries together an understanding of divine sovereignty and human freedom together in what is going to be a huge task over the next century to determine the appropriate use of these technologies. In describing ourselves as administrators or procreators, there is no easy answer, no definitive answer to any of those particular issues that I mentioned earlier on. They have to be thrashed out within the tension of being created by God and, on the other hand, being creative human beings. Between the tension of understanding the image as being stamped on us as something that's irrevocable and as something that is created in us. And as we work in the tension between divine sovereignty and human freedom that flows through us. This is the challenge that we have for this new revolution for the 21st century. May God give us the wisdom to discern the right path to take. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, very much. Thank you. A couple of announcements, and then we're going to take a break, a short break, and then regather for worship in a few minutes. Remember that tomorrow, all of our meetings during the day will be in the McKenna Chapel. We will not be here, but over in McKenna Chapel, which is across the campus. And the registration table will be set up there in the lobby. Refreshments will be served there in the lobby during the breaks, and the plenary addresses will be given in that building. Tomorrow evening, we'll gather for dinner in the Seminary Student Center, which is across the campus as well, directly behind this building. We'll gather at 6 for dinner, which will be provided by the conference to all who participate. And then immediately following the meal, Dr. Jeff Slosh will lead us with his keynote address. And so that will conclude tomorrow. Then on Thursday, we'll again gather in the McKenna Chapel in the morning for our last sessions, and then conclude the conference here in Estes Chapel with worship. Tomorrow morning, and then on Thursday morning at 8 o'clock, we'll have a time of prayer, morning prayer, and singing in McKenna Chapel. That will start at 8 o'clock, and you're all invited to attend. At 8:30, we'll introduce our first speaker and begin the conference for the day. Ms. Jenny Proctor has been the coordinator of this conference, and she will be set up in the lobby at McKenna tomorrow if you have questions about anything concerning the conference. She and the staff that work with her will be very happy to assist you. So again, we are glad that you're here. Now, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and Sarah Cobb, a student at the seminary, will be serving as our musician tonight. In about 10 minutes, you'll hear her start to play, which is the signal that it's time for us to come back together for worship with Bishop Will Williman as our preacher this evening.